Hello, welcome to From Caracas. I'm Laura Prada. In this opportunity, we'll be talking with Jon Restpo. He's a journalist, he's a researcher, and with whom we'll be talking today and understanding better and also getting closer to all about originary cultures in Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course, beyond our frontiers, so we can get closer to them. Welcome, Jon.
Gracias.
For whom are originary cultures a threat?
Well, the original cultures are a threat to the established capitalist order in the first place, the Western patriarchal order. It is a counter-proposal to modernism that has been inspiring source of the order that today governs the planet, with its ideas based on Christianity, philosophy of Descartes and other philosophers, of macroeconomic ideas of the capitalist order, and logically against political orders that, although they call themselves democratic, states in democracy and liberals, they are orders that have historically oppressed indigenous peoples. It is a threat against the ideal of civilization that dominates the world today, being white, Christian, man, successful.
¿Por qué resultan incómodas hasta cierto punto? Why does these originary communities with their culture and traditions to a certain point are awkward?
Resultan incómodas por el hecho de reclamar. They are uncomfortable by claiming the rights they have and claiming their place in creation on the planet, in the universe. Indigenous or Indians, as derogatorily are called, they are not that. They are indigenous peoples, ancestral cultures. Indians are the ones from India. They have suffered from historical discrimination because for them to exist, they have had a very close connection with the earth and with the other elements of life that exist in the universe, and that is problematic because one of the sources of wealth of the prevailing system is just the land. In Latin America, it's all too obvious. The national states were shaped from the old legacy of unjust and expired institutions inherited from the Spanish colony, an empire that was in decline and that was overthrown here in Latin America. Then there are the characteristics that indigenous peoples assume, their cultures, their worldview, the defense of natural resources, water, livelihoods, are a threat, so they can welcome to take pictures, to make postcards for the states, and tourism companies attract tourists. Indigenous people are nice and good, but in the museums.
Fue ese grito de que was this cry, I'm here, respect me, my traditions, my culture, what got some of those communities exterminated?
Of course, but first of all, it was a brutal clash that there was when the Spaniards came to these lands with the cross, with the sword, to impose an order to be the vessels of a king that they had not known, sons of a god that they did not recognize, and the way they treated them was brutal. Then it was that resistance that they opposed in many cases to the extermination so great in talking figures. Many say that it is exaggerated, between 100 and 120 million indigenous peoples who were exterminated in Latin America. However, there are still places, countries, where they are the majority of the population or represent a very, very important part of their population, like Bolivia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico.
Sobre Bolivia quería preguntarle, porque justamente en pleno siglo XXI volvimos a ver estas imágenes. Regarding Bolivia, we've seen in this 21st century images of the colonizers rising up the Bible and the sword. Of course, the sword is changed by other kind of weapons, but we saw again this picture in Bolivia. Regarding Bolivia, we've seen again in this 21st century images of the colonizers rising up the Bible with a sword. Of course, the sword changed by other kind of weapon, but we saw again this picture after a revolutionary process that transformed reposition and gave all the necessary tools to empower native communities so they could occupy their rightful place in society. How is it possible for this to happen in the 21st century? And when to a certain point indigenous peoples were the ones that turned against their own brothers and sisters?
Well, the case of Bolivia and the recent coup against the President Evo Morales is a very painful example. It is a tremendous reality that goes far beyond having a president removed and take control of a Western institution and a court. Bolivia, in my concept, has gone back 400 or 500 years. In Bolivia, there were some of the first large uprisings in the late 1700s of indigenous peoples with very courageous women and men, like Bartolina Sisa and other indigenous leaders who rose up against the Spanish and encircled peace for months. They didn't let anyone in or out. And after centuries of exploitation, humiliation, looting, a risk in Bolivia's great mining riches of hydrocarbons, the iconic Potosí, full of silver, which filled the Spanish crown and the pockets of Dutch bankers with richness. That changed in the first decade of this century, when an Indian, an insurgent Indian, like Evo Morales, came to the Bolivian parliament and tried to change the political model. He was accused of drug trafficking, of all they wanted. They took away his parliamentary immunity to try him for different reasons. However, in the first elections where he participated as a presidential candidate, he went from being the only indigenous in parliament to having more than 40 deputies of men and women from different peoples, of the more than 30 that existed, with the majority Aymara and Quechua and Guaraní, that there is change that power map.
Facilitar la comunicación con el método también para que se pudieran also facilitate communication, the literacy process, so everybody was familiarized with Aymara language so that socializing would be easier.
Of course, in fact, especially in the upper parts of Bolivia, the language used is Aymara and Quechua. Spanish is used when they come to the city or when they have to relate to the half-breed who does not know the indigenous language. The half-breed, who in general doesn't even know who he is, the indigenous does know who he is. The half-breed have that great evil and dilemma that we don't know who we are. And that's what I'm telling you. Bolivia's case is very emblematic. Evo arrives at the presidency in 2005, undertakes a series of very important changes, like the one you mentioned about the official recognition of ancestral languages such as Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, Guarayo, Guayare, Chiquitano, and others to improve relations among all Bolivians. And it makes a series of deep reforms, such as the property bailout from the people, and in the old days, foreign companies took 99% of the profits from these resources, and the Bolivian state had 1%. Evo changed that relationship that led today to even international bodies of the capitalist order to recognize a miracle in the Bolivian economy. Evo can be blamed for all they want, but they can accuse him of financially ruining the country. That's a very important achievement, and that's what Evo is getting. The other issue is that of the other change in the earth structures. That is vital, and Evo implemented laws that already existed but were not fulfilled. Issues of the rights to indigenous territories. Let us remember that at the time of the dictatorship of the 70s, the old General Banzer used to ride a plane with his generals and walk in the eastern lands, the lowlands of Bolivia, and from there handing out lands with Indians included. And he said to the generals, "Look, from the river we see there to the edge of that mountain, that is yours." They distributed it. So, when I worked in Bolivia, I found that there were landowners who had 60 or 70,000 hectares of land, and they justified that because they were for livestock, but many were idle lands. So when the government officials were going to verify that they were indeed livestock, there was what we are called tourist cows, which consisted of ranchers. A landowner lent his cows to another landowner to have them on the estate while they entertained government officials to make the measurements and verify all that. These are completely unfair and absurd things that were given in Bolivia.
Hablando de legislaciones, Bolivia es quizás el ejemplo más claro de estas legislaciones a favor de las comunidades
Speaking of
originarias.
legislations, Bolivia probably is the best example of a country with laws in favor of originary communities and indigenous peoples. In fact, probably in Latin America or even the world. So, to what extent have governments legislated favorably towards original peoples, and what have they missed or what have they taken into account?
Bueno, en el tema, digamos, de la protección legal que tienen los pueblos originarios, hay que
Let's say on the subject of legal protection that indigenous people have, we must first mention international law, which existed and exists. At first, there was a Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization, which recognized many rights of the indigenous peoples, and states that ratified that convention required them to comply with certain laws for the protection of peoples in terms of their cultural rights, their economic rights, the issue of access, the right to land, things like that. Then, more recently, a few years ago, comes the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a statement that is on par with the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. This is partly international. Based on that international regulation and the struggles of national resistance, is that Bolivia launched, even came to have laws and legislations long before Evo came to government. And the INRA law, that was called in Bolivia on the territory on the right land, existed even during the government of the old Sánchez de Lozada, a gringo. What happens is that it was not fulfilled, but this changed radically, and new laws were incorporated into the same constitution that exists in Bolivia, which recomposes the state. Is one of the largest instances of Latin America, as you mentioned it. There is another very interesting case, that is the Colombian case. In Colombia, there are beautiful laws for the protection and defense of the indigenous peoples. What happens is that they are exterminated.
We are seeing it.
There are other emblematic cases, such as the Panamanian case, specifically in the relation to the Cuna people, yes. That made a revolution in 1925, a front where a lot of rights were won and exercised, and the Cuna state in the territory, their government stake in their territory in the island of Cunayala, and part of the continent, unlike their Cuna brothers in Colombia. In the Gulf of Urabá, they are very abused, persecuted, murdered. A country that has an impressive indigenous majority, such as Guatemala, has made a great stand on this issue of rights recognition, and is a power problem. As long as indigenous people do not have power, they will be able to change that reality themselves. Who can build the instruments for the defense of their rights from a legal point of view?
Recently, we have been listening in the news what is happening in Brazil after the fire of the Amazon, due to the deforestation, the sale of lands to transnationals, and how these originary people have mobilized and took the accusations to the different international instances to prove that in fact they live and own that land. Why do they have to get to that point in which the only resource is to call on the different international instances because their government does not recognize them at all?
Of course, because the dominant structures in these countries that continue to preserve the old colonial heritage and arrogance of the landowners, elites of the national oligarchies that we have in America. The racism that eats them does not allow them to see there like the Indian. In Bolivia, when there were negotiations on the subject of territories, I spoke to some indigenous leaders, and they say to me, "Look, Jon, is that for the landowner, the target is very difficult to lie far up to sit with the children of their slaves. Our parents, they were their slaves, and now they had to sit at the same table with us. The oligarch doesn't concede because he always sees the other down. And the most awkward issue is just that relationship that indigenous people have with the natural resources, with the livelihoods, I call them. Water is vital. Land without land is impossible to existence of indigenous peoples, and indigenous peoples are the defenders of more than 80% of the biodiversity that exists on the planet. They are the only ones who can guarantee the survival of us as a species. The balance between the vital elements that for the indigenous are almost gods, like the sun, the light, the Father Fire, is a God, and He is a real God, yes? Water is the source of all life. The earth we treat, where to bury our navels, and where to bury our dead, and where we grow food. And the air, that is, without those four things, the human being cannot live. It is impossible, and the Indians are the protectors of that. And look at the dominant system, the one we mentioned at the beginning, modernist, white, Christian, male. Where has it taken this planet? We have it on the brink of the chaos, and there are a lot of people who say, and they're right, when they say that we have to leave a better planet for our children. And I differ on something. I think that we should leave is better children to our planet, which is the only one we have. And look where it is. The funny thing is that the Earth can survive us, and it will do very well if the human being disappears. In 300 or 400 years, it will recover. We can live without nature, and then the indigenous are so uncomfortable.
Thank you very much, Jon, for sharing your time here from Caracas.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you very much. Like this, we come to the end of this from Caracas. Today we've been speaking with Jon Restpo. He's a journalist and researcher with whom we've been talking today about originary cultures and inhabitants of our continent and from the world. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.